In the last video, we took a look at callbacks, which are something that you're already familiar with since you used them all across this course. And in this video, we're going to take a look at promises, which are essentially better versions of callbacks and are something that I recommend using all the time if you can. So in order to take a look at a promise, we need to first understand what a promise is. And luckily, a promise in JavaScript is essentially the same thing as a promise in real life. You are promising to do something, and you either do it and succeed, or you do not do it and you fail. That is how a promise in JavaScript works. A promise is essentially saying, hey, I am going to execute some code. And if I'm successful in executing that code, I'll let you know and give you the result. And if I'm unsuccessful in executing that code, I'll let you know and just tell you the error that goes along with that code. So let's take a look at a really simple promise. To create a promise, we just need to create a variable. In our case, const promise is equal to, and then we need to create a new promise. So we'll say new promise, just like this. This will create a new promise for us, but we need to pass some information to the promise and just give it a function, which is what it takes. And this function is the code that you want to run. It's essentially going to run right away when you create the promise, but some part of this code is probably going to take a little bit of time. Maybe you have a set timeout, or maybe you're fetching something from a database that takes time. So this function is going to take two different parameters inside of it. We have resolve and reject. You can name these whatever you want, but this is just standard naming conventions. Resolve is what happens when you successfully complete the promise, and reject is what happens when you fail to complete the promise. And then inside of the function is where we write out the code we want to run for our promise. So in our case, let's just say that we're going to write out some code that just says const sum equals 1 plus 1. We're going to say if sum is equal to 2, then it'll be successful. Otherwise, it's going to be a failure. So if it's successful, we're going to resolve with our sum. And then down here, we're going to reject, and we're just going to print out an error like this. So now we have successfully resolved and rejected. And a little bit more information, this resolve and reject variable, these are functions. And these functions are what are going to run, telling you if you got a true or false result, essentially if your promise succeeded or if your promise failed. If it succeeded, you call the resolve function and you pass it whatever you want. It can take one parameter and only one parameter, and you can pass whatever you want, or you can pass nothing. So let's just, in our case, say success, just so we can really easily see what happens. So now we've created a promise. It has some code inside of it that's going to run. This code is not actually asynchronous code because it just runs top to bottom, no problem. But imagine that to get this sum, we're querying a database, and this takes like 5 seconds to execute, just like you would with a set timeout. And then we are checking some variable to see if our sum is 2. If so, we're saying success. Otherwise, we're saying error. Now we're left with this promise variable. And in order to access this promise variable, you need to use the .then keyword. So by saying .then, you're calling the function then on your promise. And this then function essentially is the result of running resolve. Kind of think about it as then being this resolve keyword. So when we call resolve, we're really calling then on our promise. This is going to take in a function, and this function takes in whatever parameter we pass to resolve. In our case, we passed a message that says success. If we console.log our message, you'll see that this prints out success. And this is a little bit confusing, I have to admit, because it's not quite clear exactly how all of this is connected. I like to think about promises as this .then function being resolve. So whenever you see .then, that is equivalent to this resolve right here. They both are the exact same thing. So when you call resolve and you pass it something, really what you're doing is you're calling then and you're passing it in here. We're passing our message of success into this .then function here and logging that out. But what happens if we have a failure? For example, we call reject. Well, that is where the .catch keyword comes in. This is going to take in your one parameter, and we'll just say console.error. That's how you can log out a red error to the screen. So now if we save, it still says success because we have no error, so this catch never gets called. But now if we change sum to be 1 plus 2, which is not equal to 2, it's equal to 3, and save, you can see it prints out the text error for us in that nice red message by using console.error instead of console.log. Again, this is not quite clear exactly what's going on, so I want to talk about it a little bit more. .catch is essentially your catch-all for any time that you have an error inside of a promise, whether this is by using reject or by actually having an error that occurs. For example, if we were to have an error where we tried to access a variable that doesn't exist like this and save, you can see we get reference error blah, blah, blah is not defined. And if we remove this catch from here, we're going to get a different error. We're going to get an error that says uncaught in promise, and then it tells us the actual error. Essentially what that says is we had an error inside of our promise, but we didn't actually catch it. That's why it says uncaught. And then here's the error, and it happened inside of a promise. So catch not only catches when you reject, but it also catches any form of error, whether it's mistyped code, a null reference, or anything like that. So it's important to understand that when you're dealing with catches. Let's just put this back to how it was. We had a message, and we console.error that message. There we go, that's working as expected. So again, just a quick recap, this resolve function is like, hey, my promise was successful. So I'm going to, return some information. You could return nothing, or you could return something, but you can only ever return one parameter. And then that calls .then down here on your promise. Reject, on the other hand, is like your failure case. Whenever you had some unexpected error, you use the reject case. You can pass up to one parameter into it, and then that's going to be caught by this .catch down here on our promise. So now what I want to do is I want to figure out how we can actually use promises in ways that are asynchronous, because this code is not async, it just runs top to bottom, no problem. And generally when you're going to be using promises where you create your own promise, that's because you're converting code that uses callbacks into code that uses promises instead. So let's just delete all of this code that we have, and what we want to do is create a promise that wraps a normal callback piece of code. So we're going to take setTimeout, which as we know is just a function that takes a callback like this. We'll say console.log here, and then it also takes a delay for how long you want to wait until you run that code, just like this. What we're going to do is we're going to convert this into a promise where instead of passing our callback in, we're going to use .then instead to access our callback. So let's just create a function called setTimeout promise, and inside of here, I'm not 100% sure what we're going to pass yet, so let's start writing the actual code to see what would go into our function. As we know, we need to create a setTimeout, and we want to actually return this as a promise. So to do that, what you do is you take the code that you want to turn into a promise and you wrap it inside of a promise. So here we can create our new promise. This, remember, has resolve and reject. If I spelled resolve correctly, there we go. Use this as an arrow function. And inside of here, we just wrap that setTimeout code. So we'll say setTimeout. And inside of here, we already know that we want this to be console.log here, and we have a duration of 250. And in order to make sure that this gets returned, let's make sure we return this promise from our new setTimeout promise function. Now, right now, this doesn't actually do anything like we want it to because we're still using setTimeout and we're manually passing this callback in here. So what we want to do instead is have the .then of our promise resolve to this callback. So what we do here is just say resolve. We want to call the resolve function whenever we have a timeout that occurred. And what we can do is just collapse this even further, pass the reference to resolve, and now what's going to happen is our resolve function is going to get called when our setTimeout duration ends. We want to make this duration changeable, so we're just going to pass this in as a parameter to our function. Now, as you can see, setTimeout is going to call the resolve function after a certain duration, which is where the setTimeout promise is. So we can convert this code up here by using setTimeout promise with a delay of 250. We can convert it from using callbacks to using that .then promise syntax by just packing on a .then here. It's not actually getting anything passed to it. And inside of here, we're going to just console.log here. If I comment this code out and save, you see we get the exact same behavior. 250 milliseconds later, it logs out here. But this is probably also pretty confusing to look at, so let me kind of dive into exactly what's happening. First thing we're doing is creating a function that returns a promise. And by returning a promise, we have access to the .then keyword, we have access to the .catch keyword. It'd be the same thing as if we did const promise is equal to this, and then down here we did promise.then. This is exactly the same. You see they work exactly the same. We were just calling .then immediately instead of using this intermediary variable naming. But either way, it doesn't matter how you do this. So inside of this promise, what we're doing is we're calling setTimeout, which is asynchronous code as we know, and it uses the typical callback syntax. And then we're just passing in here resolve. So instead of passing our callback into setTimeout, what we're doing is saying, hey, I'm going to run this timeout, and when I'm done, I'm going to call this resolve function, which is essentially the same as calling .then. This means that we never actually have to pass our callback function into the setTimeout itself, and we can just rely on whatever .then is to be used as the callback. And then of course, we're just passing through this duration to make sure it works the same as setTimeout did before. And we don't even need this reject here, which is nice because setTimeout can never really fail. But what happens if we combine together multiple setTimeouts? So as you remember before, we had, setTimeout inside of here, We wanted to stack them together like this, for example. So we're just going to say this is going to be 1, and inside of here we'll log out 2, and for good measure we'll just do a third one inside of those, which is going to log out 3. If I just comment this code out down here, you'll see we get 1, 2, 3 being printed out, and they're staggered after each other. But we get that thing called callback hell, where you have multiple callbacks inside of each other. Well, promises actually take care of that problem for us, because we can chain promises together. Let's uncomment this code and take a look at exactly what that would be. So as you know, we have our first set timeout where it logs 1. So let's just do that here. We have our set timeout promise, 250 millisecond duration, and it's logging out 1. I think it's a little bit easier if we get rid of this intermediary variable and just do this. So now we have a 250 millisecond delay and we're logging out 1. Now the next thing we want to do is inside of here, do another set timeout promise with a 250 millisecond delay. And you would think we would put our dot then here and console.log 2. And this technically will work if I comment this out and save. You see it prints 1, then 2. But we still have the same problem of callback hell. Everything is getting deeper and deeper nested inside of each other. So luckily with promises, one thing that they do, which is amazing, is if you return a promise inside of another promise, what you can do is chain together your dot thens. So here we're returning a promise, and then we can take our dot then and put it on the outside. So we have our set promise 250. If I save this, it'll be formatted a little better. And you can see it says dot then, we're logging 1, and then we're returning a new promise. And what happens is when this new promise that we just returned actually finishes executing, it's going to call the next dot then. Even though these aren't nested inside of each other, it's smart enough to know that this dot then corresponds with the promise we returned in the previous dot then. We could nest that another step further where we're returning another set timeout. Let me just copy this down. And now here we're logging out 3. So we go 1, 2, 3. This code right here is exactly the same as the code up here. They both work exactly the same, but this code up here is very difficult to read because you have all of this weird nesting. You have to make sure you associate this bottom 250 with this top set timeout. It just is not good to look at, but this is much easier. We set a timeout for 250 and it does this. Now let's set a new one and it does this. Set a new one and it does this. It reads much more like normal top to bottom code, and it doesn't look as confusing as a lot of asynchronous code out there. We're able to create this really easy way of doing this set timeout, which is really nice. And again, the reason that this works is because we're returning a promise, and when you return a promise inside of another promise, the next dot then you call is based on the previous promise that you returned. So this dot then, this second dot then, is for this promise that we have right here. Same thing with this promise, it's associated with the next dot then. They just chain together, which is really, really useful and is the main way we can avoid that annoying callback hell. So now it's your turn to try out creating your own promise. What I want you to do is I want you to create a promise for add event listener. So we'll say create a promise version of add event listener. And essentially it's going to look a lot like this. We'll say add event listener promise. And inside of here, we're just going to take the method or whatever actually activates it. So for example, this would be like click or mouse over or something like that. And then inside of here, you need to return a new promise. So we'll say return new promise with that resolve and reject. And also inside of here, we need to take the element itself that we're adding the event listener to. What I want you to do is finish out the rest of this code for the add event listener promise. Check it out on this button here. So we can access the button by saying const button equals query selector button. So I want you to test it out on this button element, make sure it works, and just see how you could create a promised version of add event listener. So pause the video here, give yourself a chance to do this, and then I'll show you how to do it. Hopefully you've taken a little bit of time to try to create this. So what we want to do is essentially call add event listener promise with our button, and let's say click, and then we want to use this dot then here, where we could say here it's going to log out whatever console.log clicked. And we even want to still be able to access the event itself, the actual event. So we can say console.log event as well. So we want to be able to access both the clicked and the event here. So how exactly would we go about doing this? Well, inside of our promise, what we need to do is set up that event listener. So we can say element.add event listener on the method, in our case, click, and then it's going to have some code that executes inside of here. And this code is our callback. But we're trying to avoid callbacks. we want to use this .then syntax. So instead what we're going to do is just resolve. We would do resolve here, and we could pass in E, just like we get from up here. And this is going to actually work. When I click on the button, you can see it prints out clicked, as well as the mouse event down here. And if I change this a little bit, I can just plop out the word resolve here. That's just going to pass a reference to this function, which works the same as what we had written before. Now when I click, you can see it says clicked and prints out my mouse event down here. Now again, we're not actually using this reject portion of promises because there's no way for this to actually fail. But if you were fetching from a URL, for example, or a database, it could be possible that you failed to connect to it. So there would be a need to use this reject, but in this scenario, we really don't need it. So now the last thing I want to look at are some of the fancy methods on promise that allow us to do things with multiple promises. Let's just get rid of all of this code, and what we're going to do is say promise.all. What this allows us to do is run multiple promises. We pass it an array here of different promises, and then we can do things based on whether they all fail, or some of them fail, or they all succeed, or some of them succeed, and so on. And instead of writing out a bunch of different promise functions that do different things, we can actually just use a little shorthand here by saying promise.resolve, and we can pass it in a value. And this is going to return us a promise that's successfully executed with resolve. So we could say .then of message and just console.log message. If I save this, you can see it prints out value. And I could do reject here. And if I change this from then to catch, you can now see, if I make this just an error here, we're logging this out as an error because reject returns a failed promise and resolve is going to return a successful promise. So inside of this array, we could say promise.resolve 1 to 2, and let's do 3 here. So we have 3 promises that we're running, and what's happening is after all of these promises finish executing, which in our case these are immediately executing, so it's not too big of a deal, but you can imagine you had a bunch of set timeouts in here, for example, and it takes different time for each one to finish. What's going to happen is we're going to get a result inside of then that is the messages for every single one of our promises. Let's just take a look at what this is going to look like. Well, console.log messages. As you can see, we get an array that has 1, 2, and 3 being printed in it because all 3 of these promises successfully resolved, and they have the messages 1, 2, and 3 inside of them. This messages array is just the return value of all of our promises in order from top to bottom. So the first promise is the first thing in our messages, second promise is the second thing in our messages, and so on all the way to the end. And we end up with this array here. We could also do a catch, for example, with an error. And we could just console.error our error. And if you save, you notice this error actually doesn't do anything at all. We got some weird formatting. It looks like, let me just expand my screen a little bit. The way everything shows up on one line. There we go. That looks a little bit better. Just easier to read that way. So we have our different promises, and then we have the .then and the .catch. You'll notice it still prints out our .then portion. So to get our .catch portion to print out, let's say that one of these rejects. Let's just say this second one is going to be a reject. This is a failed thing. And inside of here, we'll just say error on 2. Now, if I save this, you'll notice we get an error on 2 being printed inside of our catch, but nothing happens in our .then. That's because promise.all will only ever call .then if every single promise inside of it actually succeeds. If one of them fails, any of them, doesn't matter, it'll call .catch with whatever the result of the first failed promise is. So in our case, this promise is the first one to fail, so it's going to be inside of our .catch as the error that we get, and none of the other promises even matter. Now, if we wanted to do something based on whatever the first promise is that succeeds, inside of here we can change all to any. And what this does is it'll take the very first promise that succeeds, so it could be any of these promises, whichever one is the first one to successfully execute. You can imagine if you had a bunch of promises that take various different times, the first one to execute is what gets returned. So we here just get one single message. And now if we save this, you'll see it prints out 1 because this is the first promise to succeed. If this promise rejected though, for example, and we save, we now get 3 being printed because 3 is the very first promise that succeeds. If we wanted to get the first promise that actually finishes, whether it succeeds or fails, we just change this to error on 1. What we need to do is inside of here use race. Race is just like any, but instead of getting the first promise that succeeds, it gets the first promise period that finishes, whether it succeeds or fails. So now here we get error on 1 being printed because this promise is the first one that actually fails or succeeds. And the reason in our example that it just goes top to bottom like this is because this code does not actually do anything asynchronous. There's no timeouts in them. But if, for example, this first line took 100 milliseconds to execute, this one took 50, this bottom one took 200 milliseconds, this second one would be the first one to finish, which would result in our output being error on 2 instead of error on 1. But these all take no time at all to finish. They're all immediate, which is why the order is based on the order of this array. The final type that we have here is promise.allSettled. And this is a bit of an interesting one because it is going to wait for all of our promises to finish, whether they reject or they resolve. It doesn't matter. It waits for every single one to finish. And then we get an interesting result inside of our .then. So inside of here, let's just look at what gets printed out. You can see we get 3 objects being printed, and these objects contain the status, which in our case is rejected or fulfilled for whether it was resolved or rejected. And then the reason, if we have a status of rejected, we get a reason that tells us our error. And if we have a fulfilled one, we get a value, which tells you the result of our resolve. So this kind of combines together checking the failure and the success into just one portion here. We could also go a step further and say, what if all of these rejected? We say error on 3, and we save this. Again, you still see that we just get printed out our .then. So .catch really doesn't even come into play in these scenarios because it doesn't matter whether they reject or they resolve. It's still going to just come down to our .then here because it just waits for them all to finish and then gives us the status of all of them, in our case rejected, as well as the reason or the value depending on if they succeeded or if they failed. Now there's one final thing that I want to mention about promises, which is luckily pretty straightforward. So let's say that we have const promise is equal to promise.resolve. This is going to be a successful promise. We'll just say it here as our result. So we can just come down here and say promise.then with a message. We can say console.log message. As you can see, it's logging out here because this was successful. We could also put in a .catch here for our error. And we could console.error our error. And you'll notice that does nothing, but if we change this to reject, you can see that it's going to log out our error as here. But there's another type here that we can have on top of .then and on top of .catch, and it's called .finally. And what .finally does is it executes whether .then or .catch happen. Essentially, whether your promise resolves or rejects, it doesn't matter. We always call finally. So inside of here, it just takes a function. This is never going to have actually any parameters because resolve is always going to have our message in then, and reject always has the message in catch. Finally doesn't actually take in the message itself. So inside of here, we can just say console.log finally. Now you can see we got our catch being executed, and it says here as the error, and then the code finally. And if we resolve up here instead, you can see it prints out here inside of our first .then, and then we get finally being printed out. So no matter what happens with our promise, whether it resolves or rejects, finally is always going to get called no matter what. So it's a great way to clean things up if you need to execute code no matter what happens with your promise. And that is actually all there is to promises. It's quite involved and there's a lot that you learned in this video, but we're going to be using promises throughout the rest of this course, so it's going to become quite a bit more apparent how to use them. And as you practice more and more creating your own promises, it becomes so much easier. In the next video, we're going to take a look at something called async await, which is another way of handling promises in JavaScript, which makes your code a little bit easier to read. So I can't wait to see you in that next video.